We've got airmail from God with today's reading from the Gospel of John. Here's your host, Ted Gray.
Well, thank you, and welcome to today's portion, which is John chapter 6, in which we hope to discover spiritual principles to live by. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?" And that was John 6, 1-9. After these things, it said, after these things of chapter 5, about 6 months may have passed, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, it said, that might be about 6 by 12 miles, and the multitude followed him because they saw signs or miracles, and some of them received healing. All those who were diseased received healing. Why? Why heal people? Why not prevent people from getting sick in the first place? Well, Jesus did not come into this world to abolish all diseases. If he did, then he failed miserably. But the correct answer is given to us in John 20:31. But these signs are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. That's the reason. For us, these signs were written. Miracles are not for entertainment. Miracles are not for filling a church. Miracles are not for building faith in Christians. And miracles are certainly not for making money off. We see none of that here. Miracles also belong into the street and into the fields, as we can see right here. The only legitimate need for a miraculous healing today is possessed by those who need a healing. God heals because he has mercy, as it says, speaking of Epaphroditus, Paul's fellow soldier, "For indeed he was sick almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." And that was Philippians 2:27. So God has mercy and God has compassion. God heals because he has mercy and compassion, and not to make money for hucksters. The ones who were diseased followed Jesus partly for the right reasons, namely to receive their health back. But the rest of the crowd followed him because they saw the signs, and he rebuked them later when he said, "You seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and were filled." That was out of verse 26. A lot of followers were motivated by curiosity and by food, not by faith in him, same as today. A lot of entertainment and information that tickles the curious natural mind is dished out in churches today, instead of that which sanctifies believers. Jesus said, "Sanctify them by the truth. Thy word is truth." John 17:17. And he said, "I have given them thy word," in John 17:14. We can start from the facts. The human existence can be boring, mundane, and depressing. But whenever our minds see a natural wonder or a miracle, our minds produce excitement or a high. This high is perceived as positive compared to that which is boring, so we like to see something. One guy said, "There's no right and wrong, there's only the boring and the exciting." And that's why some people opt for a life of crime, because crime is exciting, for a season, of course. Doing time then is very boring, but we don't plan to get caught. There is nothing wrong with the discovery that life can become boring. It's rooted in a very deep truth. Originally, we were meant to live with the Almighty, the eternally self-existing, the all-providing, all-knowing, and all-powerful good God. And that's exciting. Since God is infinite and we are finite, it will take eternity to get to know God. As Jesus said, "This is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent," in John 17:3. We will again forever be excited to live with, to experience, and to know God. There are the legitimate excitements for which we were created, but since sin came into this world, God left, and that is our problem. But for those excitements, we were saved and recreated. It's funny how the world thinks we need to get God out of everything. But our only problem is that God left. God left Adam after he sinned. The problem is not that he is revisiting the human race. The problem is that he left. We need to draw near to him, not away from him. It's not that we don't need any excitement. It's looking for it in the wrong places. That is the problem today. Today God can be found, he can be discovered, he can be known, and he can be understood because he has spoken to us in these last days through his Son. That's why Christians need to be into their own personal Bible study, because that is where the legitimate excitement is. If you live in Bellingham and you are interested in learning how you can study and discover truth on your own, you can leave a message on my machine and we can get together. But back to our text in John 6, Jesus floated a trial balloon, so to speak, also known as brainstorming, when he said, "Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near." Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" The others heard this too. "How are we going to feed all those people, Philip?" That question, of course, presupposes that we are going to have these people over for dinner. How many? Well, about 20,000, give and take a few thousand. In hindsight, we could see that this is a job for God only. But Philip looked to their human resources. 200 denarii, about 8 months of wages. Maybe that was what they had in their treasury. He said, "That's not even enough to buy a little food for each person." Would you believe that today it would be enough? When we do the math, we can see that a denarii was about a day's wage. So 200 days of wages today in the USA, that might be $20,000 at $100 a day. Lots of people make that and more. If we would want to feed 20,000 people with $20,000, that could buy a good fast food burger for each person when they are on sale. That would be quite adequate, especially since the little ones don't eat all of theirs. And what we can see from that is how much more money or purchasing power we have because of mechanized mass production, for which we must be thankful, and we must act responsibly, because to those whom much is given, much is required. Then there was Andrew. He apparently received a revelation from God to which his faith attached itself, and he said, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" That was verse 9. In other words, we got just a little here, but I have watched you long enough to know that you can even multiply 5 little buns and 2 sardines into enough food to feed about 20,000 people. Andrew apparently saw the principle. What is that in your hand, like Moses and his staff? And watch what God can do with that. Now, barley loaves or buns were no French rolls by any means. Barley was used for animal feed or very poor people. Good bread was made of wheat, oil, and wine, and the fish were probably pickled little fish one could take for a brown bag lunch without spoiling it. So Jesus said in verse 10, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. When we estimate a wife and 2 children for each man on the average, that could be 20,000 easy. Then we continue, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. And that was verse 11 through 13. Now that's a miracle, to multiply food for about 20,000 people from 5 buns and 2 little fish. I have no problem believing this literally, but some people try to explain the miracles away. They say the disciples probably filled a cave full of bread and fish the day before, and they handed it to him, and with his big sleeves you could not see where the food really came from. It just looked like he was multiplying it, they say. But the literal method of interpretation demands that we take it for what it says in context. It's a small thing for God to make bread if he made this universe. It's also a small thing for God to make a lion eat grass since he made the lion. But then there were leftovers. What does that teach? Well, there's a fine line between principalizing and spiritualizing. The principle I see is when God provides, he often provides more than enough. He provides generously, as it says. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church. That was Ephesians 3:20. But then we can go beyond the obvious principle and start spiritualizing or allegorizing the Bible and read into it, saying that the 12 baskets were one for each disciple. But it doesn't say that. The first problem with that is that Jesus gets cheated in that scenario. He would deserve the biggest basket, and yet there are only 12, not 13. Hopefully another valid truth is that everybody had to do something. The crowd had to sit down. The boy had to volunteer his lunch. Andrew had to volunteer his idea. The disciples had to handle all that food, and Jesus provided the rest, or the difficult part, to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish for that moment. It may lead into him being the bread of life, but for sure it proves him to be sovereign God over every area of this life. He demonstrated that he is God in a human body by having total control over diseases, over demons, over calming the storm, walking on water and making food. He could raise the dead. He was sovereign over time and distance, even laying down and taking up his own life. That's evidence that he is God. But one really out of this world, outside of this human race kind of trait he introduces, brought it from heaven really, is his ability to love. And I don't mean falling in love. That's a chemical high produced by the brain, and it only proves that we are male and female. But his ability to be selfless. He never made a miracle for himself. He could have made bread out of stones when he was hungry, but he didn't. But he came to minister to us and to give his life a payment for our sins. And this same Apostle John later wrote, "Behold, look at what out of this world kind of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God." Meditate on that. If we don't believe these miracles, we can't please God, because it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. We can't even be saved, because these miracles were written that you might believe, and that believing you might have life through his name. Until next time, grace and peace to everybody, and make melody in your hearts to the Lord. Amen.